also wouldn't be possible if we didn't have a book to talk about. And so fortunately, my mentor, Dr. Marine, introduced me to these amazing women scholars to her right. And she talked years ago about going through the editing process of this book, Mexican Workers: The Making of Arizona. And it was because of Gloria's efforts to make sure that this book and this collaboration and this anthology came together that we're able to have this event here right now. And so I'm very grateful to the women to the right of me for allowing me this opportunity to host I guess this is kind of the second official book talk, but the first one here in Phoenix, and there'll be some more to come. So have a seat. You can sit right there. Yeah, enjoy us.
Thanks for coming. Good evening. Buenas tardes. Buenas noches. Thank you for being here. We really appreciate your presence. And I want to say that on behalf of my co-editor and myself, Luis Plasencia, who now lives in Dallas, Texas, and he, as you said, I am there with you in spirit. And so we were colleagues for many years at the ASU West campus, and we all miss him dearly. But I want to thank Ellie Hutchison and Chris for conceptualizing this event, and Stephanie from the coffee shop, the owner of Fair Trade, for allowing us this venue to have the event. And I'm very happy that two of the women authors who contributed to this work, Chris Marin and Cristina Gallardo Sanidad, are here with us this evening to read from their work. Unfortunately, Ana Ochoa O'Leary, who's at the U of A campus, and who has one of the chapters on women, who participated in the labor struggle against Phelps Dodge, was not able to make it. She had a conflict in her schedule. And Jean Reynolds, who also wrote a chapter on Mexican American women in mid-20th century Phoenix, had a babysitting issue. Babysitter got sick on her, and so she has, as she said, two rambunctious toddlers. So she had to leave for home. But one of the things that we think is unique about this book is that 5 of the 8 contributors are women, and 2 of the chapters focus specifically on women's roles in work activities and labor struggles. So we're thrilled to have this opportunity to sort of approach the evening with that lens. This is a really multidisciplinary project. I'm a sociologist. We have 3 historians, 2 social anthropologists, 1 sociologist and oral historian, a public historian, and a workers' rights activist. Oh, okay, gracias. And graduate of the Human Rights and Social Justice Program at ASU, all of whom contributed to this book. So in that way, it's not these sort of standard kind of history texts. Right? It's very interdisciplinary. Why did we begin this project? Luis and I started this project back in 2012. And if you had told me I would be a part of this project, I would have said, well, my areas are in higher education, Chicanos in higher education, and feminist testimonio. But somehow, Luis is an expert on migration and borderlands theory and citizenship. But we were here in Arizona when the anti-Mexican legislation was occurring, and when the workers' rights were occurring, and SB 1070 was drafted. And so between that and the teaching that we were doing at ASU, opened the dialogue. And with respect to women workers, we wanted to make sure that women were included, which is when you look at some of the standard works on Mexican workers in Chicano labor history, it's difficult to find women integrated into those works. And so in that sense, we hope that this book opens the dialogue, inspires graduate students to examine women's roles in the production process in the labor market, And as socialist feminist scholars implored us to examine decades ago, to understand women's roles in the production and reproduction process in the labor market, in the home, and their relationship, and how it serves capitalism and patriarchy. So while we did not center a gendered analysis of women workers in this book, we believe the chapters that focus on women speak to A, how Mexican women have occupied particular spaces in the labor market in Arizona, especially as they transitioned out of agricultural work, how they have been active participants in labor movements, and how when we consider women's roles, our theoretical constructs are challenged and expanded. So one of the central concepts in the book is the notion of an elastic supply of labor. And basically, the concept allows us to make sense of how multiple sectors in the Arizona economy, whether it was agriculture, railroad, mining, construction, right, organize their labor over time. So each of the chapters examines a different period and different kinds of work, and how different factors shape and come into play with respect to the labor processes that they encounter. The status of the worker doesn't always determine how they experience the conditions and wages under which they labor. So elasticity is contingent on the economic and political cycles. Workers are expected to be available when the market expands, and then expected to disappear during periods of decline. So I'd like to begin by reading with a quote from an official of the Arizona Cotton Growers Association, who, and I'll try to sound as gleeful as he, I imagine, the manner in which he said this. And this was a quote that we have not been able to precisely document the year, but with the readings that we've done, we have concluded that he was speaking about the early period in Arizona's cotton industry, which was 1917, before 1920. Thus, in the face of the greatest demand for labor the world has ever seen, with the country at the highest point of prosperity it has ever known, the cotton growers of the Salt River Valley maintained as perfectly an elastic supply of labor as the world has ever seen and maintained. As ever seen and maintained an even low level of prices for wages throughout its territory. Outsiders looked, studied, and went away amazed at the accomplishment of such an organization. On any given day in Arizona, residents encounter a common circumstance. Thousands of workers of Mexican descent labor each day to make our lives possible in urban and rural areas. The majority of such workers are largely invisible. Their work as child caretakers, dishwashers, or cooks in restaurants, hotel housekeeping staff, caretakers of the elderly, and in many other settings remain in the shadows of an economy dependent on their labor. Their presence in labor sustain conveniences and consumer prices we have grown accustomed to, as well as key economic activities that benefit the state economy. To visit Yuma in the winter for the harvesting of lettuce, or a Home Depot in the suburbs, to drive by a new residential construction area, or to see the myriad landscapers as one drives through residential areas. One sees Mexican descent workers performing numerous work activities. Mexican origin workers, both invisible and visible, whether in public or private spheres, are essential to our standard of living. Paradoxically, however, both historically and contemporarily, Mexican workers occupy a space where employers classify them as a needed low-wage, elastic supply of labor. Because on the one hand, US workers are allegedly not available, and on the other hand, segments of the public sphere perceive them as an unwanted foreign group, harming the economy and society. This anthology aims to expand our understanding of this paradox. So that's the beginning. And from there, I'd like to open the floor to Chris.
Yes, sure.
All right, okay.
Mexicano miners, dual wage, and the pursuit of wage equality in Miami, Arizona. So I begin in this manner. According to the 1940 census, at least 4,722 people lived in Miami, Arizona. Mexicans, Mexican Americans, Italians, Serbians, Spaniards, Swedish, Irish, English, Lithuanians, Greeks, Germans, all classified by census enumerators as white. The 1940 census notes that Mexicans and Mexican Americans with Spanish surnames spoke Spanish. Many were born in the United States. Many were bilingual. Many were able to read and write and speak English and Spanish, and were educated in the U.S. public schools in Arizona. World War II revitalized Miami's economy from the dismal state of the affairs of the Great Depression of the 1930s and made new demands for copper to provide electricity for war industries and to support domestic demand for copper. Mexicano miners again turned to challenge the unequal wages and demands for copper. They began unionism efforts. They welcomed the presence of the International Union of Mine, Mill, and Smelter Workers, the IUMMSW, to help them end the dual wage system and employment discrimination so prevalent in the Miami mines. They formed Local 586 of the IUMMSW and hoped that their union might be able to negotiate wage equality and equality for them in general. Their objective was to end the dual wage and end workplace discrimination. In the autumn of 1943, some members of LULAC, the League of United Latin American Citizens, LULAC chapter number 111, LULAC chapter 110 had been formed in Miami. LULAC chapter, it's the other way around. LULAC chapter 110, Phoenix, LULAC chapter 111, Miami. So in the summer of 1943, members of LULAC, Phoenix chapter, traveled to Miami from Phoenix and met with members of Local 586 and members of the auxiliary of the Local 586, and met with Orville Larson, labor organizer and labor representative for, at that time, the IUMMSW. They carried with them a letter of support from LULAC that spelled out their concerns regarding the civil rights of the Mexican Americans and the Mexican American miners in Miami. Plática Garcia Smith, the president of LULAC, and Maria Garcia, the vice president of LULAC, asked Larson to present their letters to the representative of the Non-Ferrous Metals Commission. This gesture of goodwill on the part of LULAC Council number 110 did not go unnoticed by the miners in Miami. It is not clear if any impact the letter from LULAC Council number 110 of Phoenix may have had when Orville Larson made contact with the Non-Ferrous Metals Commission, or if he actually sent the letter to the agency. Cordial and amicable relationships continued between LULAC Phoenix and LULAC Miami during the war years, continued in the post-war period, and it was important to note that LULAC Council Number 110 and LULAC Council Number 111 of Miami challenged the views of labor relations and mining companies' patterns of a dual wage system of pay and discrimination in the copper mines itself. The female laborers who worked at the Miami Copper Company or the smelter or at the Inspiration Copper Company, female laborers comprised of Anglo women and Mexican American workers. Mexican American women and Anglo women were called laborers. Sometimes they were called helpers. Sometimes they were called laborer one. They could never rise in classification. They were laborer one, laborer two, laborer three, or helpers 1, 2, or 3, these working women. Anglo-American women who worked for the mines were classified as skilled workers. They were secretaries, they were chemists, they were telephone operators, they were communication experts. They were skilled workers, but they had these jobs because they were white. Mexican American women and African American women who worked in the company or who worked in the mines did this kind of work. They dug ditches, they filled ore carts with water, with waste materials, they cleaned tools and machinery. But Anglo-American women in this laborer classification earned and made higher wages per shift than Mexican American or Mexican women worked in this laborer classification. Anglo women also earned higher wages per shift than Mexican or Mexican American women. And the earnings of 31 Anglo female laborers ranged from $5.21 to $6.36 per shift. 13 Mexican American or Mexicana women worked as laborers. They earned only $5.21 per shift, as opposed to Anglo women who earned more. So we have a discrepancy in wages. We also have discrimination in the workplace. We also have that the company denies these kinds of things. So when the government asks them for documentation to show why they are paying women less, why they are paying Mexican American women less, why they are paying African American women less, management chooses to ignore the demand for this information. Management chooses to ignore time after time to send the reports of these classifications and the wages of these workers. Management continues time after time to deny the requests of the government, especially this commission established by President Roosevelt. Management continues to deny reports to be sent to Washington, D.C. Instead, what management does is they hire their attorneys to fight these kinds of suggestions and recommendations on the part of government. And so we have in the end, management fighting, attorneys for management fighting, requests by the government to send statistics and information and to explain this kind of racism and discrimination. So this is where I write.
Purpose in contributing to this book was I had met a lot of workers who had come to the Worker Rights Center where I worked, who had experienced wage theft and discrimination, different violations of their rights, and I wanted to amplify their voices. I wanted their stories and their perspectives to be heard. So it seemed most appropriate that I would read their words, specifically read their stories. So this will be a little bit disjointed because their stories are kind of interwoven in different sections of the book, but I've chosen 2 of the 5 workers whose story I'll read to you. Trained as an agricultural engineer in Mexico, Marco immigrated without authorization to the United States 7 years ago with his wife, after his brother told him he could earn more money as a construction worker in the United States. Now with 2 U.S.-born children who have dual citizenship,
His family is of mixed immigration status. Both he and his wife support their growing family, he with the temporary work he finds in drywall installation, remodeling, framing, or concrete. His wife with the consistent part-time work in a fast food restaurant. Marco claims he can speak and understand about 10% of English and admits initially he only understood technical English terms for plant biology, diseases, and care due to his university training. His English has not improved much, and as he has worked solely with other Spanish speakers. A migrant from León, Guanajuato, Mexico, Alfonso traveled to the United States in 1989, shortly after the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act was passed, which granted amnesty to migrants between the years 1987 and 1988. He has followed the work, laboring in both agriculture and residential construction, and living in 5 states: North Carolina, Kentucky, Arizona, California, and Wyoming. He considered moving to a 6th state after SB 1070 passed. Alfonso attended elementary school in Mexico and says he understands about 35% of English. He is the sole provider for his wife, an undocumented migrant, and their 6 U.S.-born children, supporting them with his earnings from construction and remodeling. None of the 5 workers initially entered into construction work as a career. Rather, they responded to the labor needs of the Phoenix market, enticed onto job sites and into private homes, to labor at a time when construction work was stable and they were welcomed. Each of them secured constant work for decent pay through word of mouth, and few questions were asked regarding their experience or work authorization. Reflecting on his early experiences finding work in the industry, Marco reasoned, quote, "Before, since there was a high demand for construction, the construction companies needed labor, and they opted for convenience. It's convenient for the contractors to not verify the legal status of workers because they employ Latino people who you can pay less and who will sacrifice more to work." End quote. Through various workplace experiences, the 5 workers learned that employment verification and licensing requirements were not the only requirements contractors ignored. Companies were also lax on paying minimum wage and overtime, making payments on the designated payday, providing workers' compensation after workplace accidents, and adhering to health and safety regulations. Contract law was similarly ignored as written and oral agreements between contractors were not respected nor enforced. Quote, "In the beginning, I worked comfortably with my boss. Then suddenly he started falling behind. When there wasn't enough money, he did not pay us. But when there was, he would pay us everything he owed us. So that's how we went along. But we began to see that he would not finish one job or the other, and the amount he owed us began increasing." End quote. For much of his employment, Alfonso had been paid on time and in full. His employer, Mr. Reynolds, was the sole business owner of a remodeling company that worked without licensing, bonds, or permits in the informal economy. He secured jobs through word of mouth. For years, they worked together, Alfonso becoming like a son to Mr. Reynolds. So when Mr. Reynolds told Alfonso that the homeowners were not paying him, preventing Mr. Reynolds from paying him, Alfonso continued working, understanding he would have to be flexible and accommodating with pay dates and pay amounts. Throughout his employment, Mr. Reynolds had Alfonso purchase tools, wood, or other supplies needed for projects and reimbursed him. Although if Alfonso needed safety equipment or water, he was to purchase his own. Alfonso eventually approached the homeowners directly to notify them that he had not been paid his wages or reimbursements, as the contractor was waiting for their payments. Alarmed that Mr. Reynolds had pocketed their large payments without compensating Alfonso, the homeowners began working with Alfonso directly to finish the job and paid him directly. Quote, "We were enduring our job for the money he owed us. The amount kept increasing until he was the one that left. We didn't see him anymore." End quote. Alfonso attempted to track down Mr. Reynolds, calling and visiting his home to collect his wages with no success. On one occasion, when Alfonso did locate Mr. Reynolds, he denied owing Alfonso a dime. The only one to work completely outside of all regulatory systems, Alfonso witnessed the ease with which his employer stopped paying him and disappeared. Left to regulate himself with no oversight, his employer simply chose not to comply with state or local laws, including those regulating the employee-employer relationship. As As a pretext for not paying them, Juan's, Alfonso's, and Marco's bosses attributed the non-payment of wages to the failure of the labor procurers to pay. Irrespective of that fact, the employer has an obligation to pay his workers on time and in full. However, workers were especially accommodating of their employers, accepting lack of payment or late payments when they believed their employer was struggling financially. As the economic boom ended and the businesses were less economically viable and stable, the non-payment of wages and other law violations became more egregious and blatant. Marco's story highlights the extreme expectations for labor flexibility. Understanding the company's hardship and feeling grateful for the work they received in the past, Marco and his 19 coworkers were flexible with payment amounts and pay dates. The concrete company for which they worked lined up construction jobs, spending the money it received up front to cover expenses on other projects, and when the time came to do the work they had postponed, there was no money for material or labor. Between March and October 2007, Marco was only paid $100 to $300 per week, though he was earning $500 per week. The employer gave each worker enough to survive and to keep coming back to work, each hoping for full payment at some point. Quote, if we had been receiving on average $500 per week, they were giving us half or a little less than half, 40% of our wages, to keep us more or less content, because they were saying there was no money and that they had still not received the pay from the projects. In the end, I calculated my hours, and they owed me $4,000 in wages. For the others, it varied. 2 of my coworkers are owed almost $10,000 for that time. To the others, it was some $2,000, $4,000, $3,000. When Marco and his coworkers sought assistance from the Worker Rights Center in 2008, they were each owed between $2,000 and $10,000. Without his full wages, Marco was unable to sustain the simple life he had created with his wife and 2 children. His marriage and family life were quickly affected by the financial problems, as the family absorbed the employer's costs by minimizing their own, only having enough for the most essential items. His physical and emotional health also deteriorated. The effect of both the recession and the normalized and institutionalized discrimination against Mexican workers in the form of wage differentials, fewer benefits, and greater workloads worsened with the political climate, which facilitated an implicit and explicit culture of violence in the workplace. This is a quote from Marco. We didn't receive our wages, we received the opposite. We received discrimination. The owner, the manager, was threatening that he was going to report us to immigration, to the sheriff, in order to intimidate us. Some of my coworkers, yes, he scared them, and they preferred not to push the matter and leave it in peace. The majority was like that. They were uneasy about finding solutions to the problem. Alfonso and Diego focused on the explicit barrier that documentation status and being a migrant presents. Alfonso claimed, quote, it is like the employer takes advantage of the fact that one does not have papers. Because if I had papers, if I had a license, I could talk more and I would go to court. In my country, I'm free to talk more comfortably. You have to pay me in my country, or you're going to figure out how to resolve this. Give me something. But here, you can't do any of that. Paranoid about working for another employer again, Marco commented that, quote, employers see you with the need to work and they simply don't pay. They deny it, they hire. It affects you. One feels repressed or worthless. One feels less valuable. Problems occur because they spurn you. Okay. Workers elected the most cost-effective and least aggressive or rewarding methods of recourse. Juan and Marco chose to file insurance claims through the Register of Contractors against the contractor's bond because their employers were not solvent and the bond was the only known pocket of money left. An investigation of the claims resulted in the revocation of the contractor's license and the collection of a small percentage of the amount owed. Their co-workers, who expressed fear of and little interest in pursuing back wages, received none of the wages owed to them. Marco's employer opened a new business entity without any investigation performed by government agencies in regards to complaints, debts, or penalties assessed against his former entities. His debts did not transfer from one company to another, and he continues to use the same business strategies. Similarly, Alfonso saw that his employer suffered no negative consequence for his failure to pay wages. His employer simply skipped town for another job opportunity. Though Alfonso secured a default judgment at a civil court in 2009, 1 year after performing the work, the judgment lien for $10,080 has yet to be paid, and Alfonso has had to absorb the court-related costs.
were but 2 passages that mentioned Mexican workers in that history. And as we began to conduct the oral histories and found that in some cases 4 generations of families had worked for Goodyear Farms, and yet they had been completely erased from the history that existed. And so this chapter is really my response to that. And I said, I'm going to write into history how the camps were started, why cotton came to Arizona, and what role Mexican workers played in relationship to the cotton industry. And so, so the section I'm going to read from pertains to the gendering of the elasticity of labor that I referred to earlier. With respect to the cotton industry in Arizona and the role of Mexican labor, the Goodyear Company's entry into Arizona in 1916 and its investment in cotton production integrated Arizona into a borderlands global system of textile production, challenging the largely US-centric framework that dominates discussions of the cotton industry in Arizona. Second, to achieve their interests pertaining to cotton, Goodyear, a conglomerate of agricultural interests, and the state mobilized to immobilize. That is, Mexican workers as a, quote, foreign labor force, unquote, were massively recruited and mobilized to fulfill the labor needs of large-scale agriculture in Arizona. One centered around cotton, yet were subsequently immobilized once in the United States. Third, evidence for this immobilization includes the policies and activities of the Southwest Cotton Company and the Arizona Cotton Growers Association, and the restrictions and repressions that they imposed on the recruited workforce. With the decline of the cotton boom and the subsequent abandonment and mistreatment of Mexican workers, the stage was set for a pattern of racialization and mobilization/immobilization of Mexican workers that carries us right into the present day. On September 5th, 1917, the Arizona Republican, in an article titled, quote, "Cotton Pickers Coming from Mexico," unquote, announced, "The Mexicans are coming," exclamation point. A whole trainload of them, men, women, and children, will arrive in the valley tomorrow, the very first importation by the cotton growers of the Valley of Labor to help harvest cotton this season, unquote. And the recruitment of Mexican workers by the thousands is indeed what took place. As the amount of acreage in cotton grew from 33,000 in 1917 to 230,000 acres by the 1920 to 21 season, so did the increasing urgency and reliance on a Mexican workforce recruited for temporary admission. The task of documenting the number of workers that were brought into the United States during this period is muddled with contradictory evidence and conditions. Between 1917 and 1921, the official statewide count of workers brought under the temporary admissions program was 72,862, and 33,460 of those were reportedly brought in by the ACGA. The actual number of workers that came under the auspices of the ACGA, however, is unknown because family workers accompany many of the workers. Of the portion that came in through the efforts of the ACGA, the official total better reflects the number that they designated as individual admitted workers, but not necessarily how many individuals were physically admitted that accompanied each individual worker or that joined their respective family members to work in the field. Early on, growers growers articulated a preference for family men, under the notion that a breadwinner would be more motivated to work in order to provide for his family and less likely to engage in labor organizing activities, right, of a dissenting nature. And while a preference for family men was not unusual during the early part of the 20th century, the preference within the cotton industry played out quite differently from that of the mining industry. Benton Cohen talks about the preference in mining for family men in terms of a family wage, the practice being that white men, and white men only, were considered deserving of a wage tied to a standard of living capable of sustaining an entire family unit. In mining, this did not apply to the wages paid to Mexican men, whom employers conveniently, relying on racial ideology that depicted Mexicans as an inferior race, argued did not need or deserve a comparable compensation for their work. The establishment of a racial hierarchy within the mining industry's workforce set up the terms and rationale under which workers from different racial ethnic groups would receive different wages, most commonly referred to as the dual wage that Chris talks about in her chapter, despite in some cases doing similar kinds of work. But in cotton, particularly during this intensified period of recruitment of Mexican workers, a primarily Mexican workforce accomplished the production processes related to the harvesting of cotton. Hence, a dual wage structure was deemed unnecessary in the cotton industry. Mexicans were the preferred labor force to whom growers could also, in their self-designated authority, pay the abysmally low wages. And even though growers actively sought out family units, they chose not to pay a family wage to individual Mexican workers, reproducing a racialized, gendered construct to be exclusively applied to white men. Insidiously, however, they relied on families to serve as the primary production units from which to have their work conducted. But the idea of supporting a family man also suited growers' paternalism towards Mexican workers, allowing them to control the workforce while pretending to extend to them the rights and privileges afforded other men. In defining the family as a preferred production unit, the ACGA was also able to utilize the labor of women and children who entered the country with their husbands and fathers, without counting either as part of their official workforce. It became a common practice not to pay women or children as formal individual employees for their work, but instead added the fruits of their labor into the calculations of poundage that was paid to the male head of household. So the participation of women in agricultural work is not as widely studied as one might expect, given the focus on work by scholars of Chicano labor history and the extent to which Mexicans' labor force participation rates in agriculture dominated for a significant part of the 20th century. 2 minutes? Okay, all right. So let me get to, okay. In the context of the 1917 to 1921 time period, women were admitted as temporary workers under the Department of Labor's Ninth Proviso implementation provisions, granted identification numbers, photographed, and subjected to the processes of other male workers. Equally important, however, women were also incorporated into the labor force, but not officially counted, and their labor power instead became part of the production of the family unit, with wages being paid to the male head of household. The latter rendered the work that women did in the production processes as formally unpaid work. It also rendered the work that children did as formally unpaid work. While their labor was extracted and commodified, it was not fully recognized as wage work and instead relied upon indirect payments through the male head of household. The ability of women and children to exchange their labor power for wages was rendered invisible, creating a hierarchy of unremunerated workers and employers ideally situated to benefit from that cushion and the profits made possible by by the labor of the family unit. Thus, the additional family members available for work provided a gender elasticity to the labor force that ACGA and the vested interests came to rely on, bringing new meaning to how we understand the making and workings of an elastic supply of labor. For these families to transfer together, right? That 40-page document had the names of the worker, or the names of, or like worker with family. That's it. That's it.